key to starting the disassembly and therefore dropping the motor assembly down so that you can get to the interior to change out, say, these screws here that are clamping down on the bushing, hence they're called bushing clamps, is to take this yoke assembly right here, which is connected to the chassis, out of play. Now there's two methodologies that have been used. One is to remove the screw while the yoke assembly is in place. But notice that the screw does not pinch down on the yoke assembly. You'll notice that the motor should not only rotate laterally left or right, it should also rotate vertically, up and down like this. I mean, that, after all, that's what's going to give the train the ability to ride over changing grades. Hence, the front motor starting up a grade, the back motor still horizontal. So we've got to disengage the motor from that yoke assembly right there. Underneath the yoke assembly is the field clamp. And you can't quite see it. You can barely see the brass edge right there. The field clamp is what holds the field in place. Thing right there is just the common part of these electrical motors. Then running through the field, as we would suspect, is the armature and the commutator. So one train of thought is, pardon the pun, is to remove this screw with this yoke assembly in place. That's not really pinching down, and that's not too difficult to do, but it's good to be careful with these screws because they are harder metal than the chassis, and you want to maintain the threads, the path of the threads into this piece. You don't want to damage it, and because these are harder than this, that's possible. The other methodology that Mr. Barker recommends and that I usually use, and no reason not to, is I'll insert a knife between, just a common pocket knife blade, between the yoke assembly and the field clamp. Here and here. Pinching or pulling this out and getting it off of that screw, because all it does is just rest on the screw. So pull it off and drop it down, and therefore it's going to be used going backwards to assemble it because it is very challenging to hold the yoke assembly, the field clamp in place while you're trying to set that screw. And I have stripped these before trying to shoehorn that in, and that was a mistake. Never again. I went back to Mr. Barker's technique, and we'll go in the opposite direction. We'll actually tighten the screw down on the field clamp, and then we'll simply snap the yoke assembly in place over that. I've inserted the knife blade between the yoke assembly and the field clamp. It just slid in. You'll notice that the yoke assembly started to pull away. And I'll just slide it down, and then once I know that it's out beyond the screw, I can start shifting the motor just a little bit in one direction or the other, because now it's not held in place with a screw. Flip it around, and hopefully that screw will not snap back into place. This is where two knives might come in handy. Leave one in place, take the other one to the other side, and Mr. Barker says just slide it down and pull it out. Oops, I didn't quite have that one disengaged. Wiggle it out. Now let's go to the other side and see if that one stayed out. Yep, it did, I think. Yep. So all I want to do now is wiggle that loose. Take up, that one snapped back into place. Darn it. Let me just make sure I see which way I slid this one. Oh, I slid it toward the front. So let's reinsert the knife. And we'll kind of just lever it toward the front. And the yoke assembly, unless I've re-engaged it on this side. Slide it back again. Disengage it. Hopefully in the same direction as the other side. Yay, I did. And continue pushing it forward until it disengages. Now here is where the shortness of those wires is going to come into play. I'm already seeing that the wires are pulling up on the motor. So I've got to figure out a way to get some of these wires tucked in here to give me a little bit more freedom of movement here. Now I was able to get the chassis to stand upright adjacent to the motor. And this ought to provide enough room that I can now reach these screws here that hold the bushings on, the clamps. And of course, these things here, these black things that I can't quite show you without moving the camera, but I will move in just a moment, are nothing more than covers over the worm gear, holding grease and oil and such for a complete casing on those. This is the brush bracket assembly. There's the brushes, and the armature and the commutator are beneath this, and there's the field. Now, in order to remove this, I need to disengage this screw on both sides, because this screw is pinching down on this field clamp right here. But before I move it any, there are two screws, one on each side of the field clamp, at the top of the field clamp that I'm pointing to. Let me focus in just a little bit. One on each side. And these are what center the field over the armature. Now, you don't have that problem usually on steam locomotives, because the field is held in place because of the way it cradles into the motor itself and the fact that it has long screws that pass through it. You can't get it hardly out of alignment. It's not true on this one. These are kind of free to move in here. But what I'm going to do with these field screws is I'm going to use the slot on the screw, not to loosen it up, but I'm going to mark it with a pin so that I'll know where these screws were should they accidentally be moved. I don't want to move because somebody at the factory positioned this clamp over the field properly at one time. It's not fun to center one of these. It's a trial and error exercise, but you'll know it if it's not centered, because either the motor won't run or it'll arc if the field touches the armature. You simply don't want that. So I'm going to mark these first before I start any other kind of disassembly. On both sides of the field clamp, I used a fine point marking pin to mark the position of the slot on the screw. Did this on both sides. And I'll be careful when I'm cleaning this clamp or any part of the motor that I don't erase those. It doesn't guarantee that I know what revolution the screw is on when it met those two marks, but at least I'll have some idea of where it ought to be to center that field.